Hi guys, this is Andrew with Headphones.com. Welcome to the Headphone Show, and today we're going to take a look at the Focal Elex. That's right, Elex. Nobody has ever said this any other way. There's only one way to pronounce this, and every other pronunciation is incorrect. We're going to take a look at the Focal Elex. This is a collaboration between Focal and Drop. This is an over-ear, open-back, dynamic driver headphone that comes in at around $700. Let's take a look. As a disclaimer, this headphone was sent to me by Drop, but they did not pay me to say anything in particular about it. And as usual, there's a link in the description for the measurements of this headphone done on the industry standard measurement rig if you guys want to take a closer look. All right, so for this review, I'm going to go through the usual categories that I'd like to discuss, but I'm mainly going to be comparing this to the Focal Clear because what's going on here with the Elex is that this is essentially the Elex with different pads on it that's being tuned to make it sound a little bit closer to the Clear. And this comes in at a significantly lower price tag than the Focal Clear. And I do also want to mention that this is the second time that I've heard this headphone for an extended period of time. I do notice a little bit of a difference between this unit and the previous one that I evaluated, so it's likely that there is some unit variation going on with these as well. The first thing to notice with the design of this headphone is that it is all entirely black. This is completely black for literally every single piece of it. And of course, when looking at this, I'm left wondering how much more black can this get? And the answer is none. None more black.
None is that good? More black.
This is the usual Focal design with the spring-loaded cups here. You get the usual extension here. And if you take a closer look at the pads, they do feel surprisingly close to the pads that are on the Clear. Now, I'm not ready to say that these are exactly the same pads. Obviously, these are black, but it's a very similar kind of material to it, and they are also perforated. So the aesthetic design, in my opinion, is fantastic. I love this kind of look. It's very sleek. It feels reasonably sturdy. There's no weird rickety issues or anything like that going on. It doesn't feel like it's going to fall apart in my hands. There's metal on the mesh here. I think if I had to nitpick the build quality, it would be that, you know, the underside of this, I think, could maybe deteriorate over time or maybe not feel as, you know, well connected, because it does feel like it's a little bit on the loose side. It's just sort of leather covering this headband piece. For comfort, in spite of the fact that this is 450 grams, it's a little bit on the heavy side. This is reasonably comfortable. I'll just show you what it looks like when I wear it. This is the same kind of comfort that you get with the Clear and the Elex. It's pretty darn good. For accessories, you don't get the hard shell case, but you do get two cables. This is one of them here. I hate this cable. And this is the other cable here, which is terminated in 4-pin balanced. I also hate this cable. As much as the cables look nice, I find that functionally they're really not that great because they're very stiff, they keep their shape a lot, and so usually the first thing I do is I replace the cable for Focal headphones. So finding a replacement cable shouldn't be all that difficult if you do find that it bothers you. Now, I have to address the big elephant in the room when it comes to the build quality with these. And it's that, you know, there have been some reports that have come out about some poor quality control issues or, you know, driver failures or the clipping issue that happens with some Focal headphones. And I've seen these issues. I've seen videos of this stuff. And I don't doubt that, you know, maybe there are some problems there. But one thing I think is really important to remember with this stuff is that nobody is ever going to tell you, you know, 6 months or even 2 years down the line passionately how their headphones are still working, because that's what they're supposed to do. Inevitably, with all manufacturers, there are going to be some failure rates, and you're most likely going to hear from those people who've had them fail on them more so than you are the people who haven't had any issues. And so with that out of the way, anecdotally, I've never had any of these issues with Focal headphones that people are reporting. Just to be clear, I'm not saying they don't exist, and if there's a problem, then that's bad. But for me, I've never experienced them. So with that said, I think you guys have to make up your own mind about this, because all I can really offer you here is more anecdotal evidence of, well, it worked fine for me. So what I can't tell you about any of the failures that have happened because they simply haven't happened for me. I haven't ended any of the issues. These don't clip. I've tried to get these to clip and they don't. Like I've cranked up the bass. I've thrown on the most like intense sub bass kind of music. I've used sine waves below 100 hertz, and it just, I can't seem to get it to do it. All right, so let's talk about how this sounds. And for anyone wondering, I've been running this off of a wide range of sources, all the way from the Topping L30, the Magni 3 Heresy, the Cayenne IHA6, the Cayenne HA1A Mark II, that's the tube amp behind me, and I'll talk about that in a little bit, the Phonitor X as well. This is actually an 80 ohm headphone, so you can run this off of a wide range of sources. You don't really need that much power to be driving it. In fact, most of the stuff that's out these days that's super inexpensive is overkill for this. Now, as far as the transducer in here, this is, of course, Focal's M-shaped dome driver with the formless voice coil. They've made a big deal about how the mobile assembly on their headphones is very, very light as a result of not having the former in there, or the cylinder in there. But there is a difference in the driver between the Elex and the Clear, because remember, this is the driver that was in the Lear as well. And from researching this a little bit, it turns out that the difference in the driver is primarily in the voice coil. So with the Lear and the Elex, you have a copper-clad aluminum voice coil, and in the Clear, you have a solid copper one. And this is likely also one of the reasons why the Clear is a little bit easier to drive. So maybe you have a little bit better conductivity there, and that means you maybe have to use less material. This is one of these trade-offs that I think is kind of interesting. And it's really cool because I do think there are some performance differences, but they are still very, very close. So I just wanted to point that out, that these are different drivers between the Elex and the Clear. Now, as far as tangible technical performance goes and that kind of stuff, the Elex is surprisingly close to the Clear. I think for overall detail and image clarity, this is just like a tiny little step back from the Clear in the mids, and in the treble and in the bass, I don't think there's that much difference. I hear it in the mids, even though I think the mids are probably the strongest aspect of this headphone, the mids and the bass. But it's fantastic on this. Just listening to piano tones and the balance for fundamental and harmonicas there, and the frequency response as well. String instruments were fantastic on this headphone. Vocals, again, anything that has a lot of mid-range presence there, because of how well balanced this is in the mids, and then the image clarity that comes through, it's really spectacular, at least at this price. Again, I'm surprised. The treble, I think, is, while it's detailed, it's just a little bit on the gritty side, but I think there's a reason for that, and we'll get into that. For speed and dynamics, this is a very fast, tight, well-controlled headphone, but importantly, this is one of the punchiest, most impactful headphones I've ever heard. In fact, I can't think of any headphone under $1,000, any open back headphone under $1,000 that's more punchy than this one. So this is, fantastic in that sense. Now, as far as how close it gets to the Clear, well, I think for dynamics, I think it's right up there. I don't think there's any real difference there between the Clear and the Elex, even if the Clear does maybe just a little better as far as detail goes. So, I think for technicalities, you're getting very similar performance. So all the things that the Clear does well, the Elex does well. And all the things that the Clear doesn't do quite so well at, like, for example, soundstage, the Elex also doesn't do quite so well at. Now, for imaging, I don't think there's all that much wrong here. I think the imaging is pretty good. It's just that the whole image is a little bit more towards you and in your face. So that does also mean that some of the details that you get, they're a little bit more front and center and intense. But at the same time, this isn't like the Sennheiser HD6 series with the 3 blob effect. You do get a filled in stage there, so I didn't have any issues with that whatsoever. And you do get that same really good surgical precision imaging from the higher end Focals as well. So I'm really impressed with this for its technical performance. It's definitely a step up from the HD6 line, which I've just been doing comparisons with recently as well. Now, of course, there's always that question of, is there any metallic timbre going on here? And I think maybe there's a little bit of an artificial kind of sound there, but I think this is also in part due to the frequency response that exists there in the treble. You hear that this is using an aluminum magnesium driver, and you think metal drivers, metal sound, and I don't really think that's the case. If anything, maybe this is just something that shows up in frequency response, and we can correct it with EQ afterwards. But really, I don't think it's that bad on this at all. In any case, let's talk about frequency response and tonal balance for the Focal Elex, because once again, it's very similar to that of the Focal Clear. On the whole, just like with technical performance, the things that the Clear does well, the Elex does well, and the things that the Clear does not so well, the Elex does also not so well. But let's start with the bass. And the bass with the Elex is fantastic. It's well extended. Not completely to the Harman 2013 bass shelf for, the sub bass, but it's pretty close. And for the rest of it, it's fantastic for how well this is extended. It's not as linear and well extended as, something like the HiFiMAN and Nanda, where it goes all the way down into the sub bass, perfectly flat line there. This does still drop a little bit there in the sub bass, but I don't think anybody's going to mind, because the benefit here is that you get all that, excellent punch and slam. You get the dynamic impact. So, the excursive force is really felt as a result. And so, people who are really into planars might prefer that kind of, linear planar bass. But for me, I definitely prefer the engagement factor that you get from the punch and slam of the bass of this. Now, moving up into the mid-range, this doesn't follow the contour of the Harman shelf there quite, perfectly. And this just means that you get a little bit more body and richness of tone there in the lower mids. And for some people, that's going to be totally fine. And for other people, they might prefer a more well-defined bass shelf. For the upper mids, this does follow the target reasonably well. It elevates at, the appropriate place for where the ear resonance starts, right up above 900 hertz. It's a little bit forward there at around like 1.5K, but it's totally well balanced up into the upper mids. And this is, again, one of the reasons why piano tones come across so well. I do think that the Focal Clear does this just a tiny little bit better, at least, perceptively. I think the measurements are actually very similar here, but this is where I think there's just a little bit better detail there for the Focal Clear. And then above that, 4 or 5K, that's when you do get a bit of a recession there on the Elex, and it's there on the Clear as well. And then, the same thing when we move into the treble with both the Clear and the Elex. You get a 6K peak and you get an 8K peak. So that somewhat, let's say, gritty treble presentation is there on this the same way that it's there on the Clear. Now, again, that is nitpicking a little bit, because while it might look like a little bit of a spiky treble response there, you don't really hear it that way on most recordings. Like, very occasionally does it come through like that. I just find, if you compare this to the Sennheiser HD650 or 6XX, that headphone is a little bit smoother there in the treble. So while the energy in the treble is appropriate for the most part, there's a little bit of that sort of peakiness in there that does cause a little bit of, like an aggressive or edgy kind of sound. And again, it's the same thing with the Clear, where it's just a little bit on the gritty side there for, the S's and F's and T's, the consonant sounds. It's not like the consonant sounds, the sibilant tones are emphasized a lot. It's more just because of the shape of that elevation. It's not as smooth when you hear them. But again, because this whole range is a little bit, on the relaxed side, overall, it doesn't actually get that fatiguing for long periods of time. Now, where this deviates a little bit from the Focal Clear, I find, is that the Focal Clear has a little bit more energy in the 10, 11, 12K range, where the Elex does not. And in some ways, that's better for the Elex, and in other ways, it's better on the Clear. So the air, if you really like having a little bit more air and treble extension there, the Clear is the one that does that a bit better. And if you want something maybe a little bit more relaxed there, then the Elex does that better. But I also did find that, on the Clear, that was one of the areas that I did EQ down. So 10K was something that I would EQ with a very narrow Q value by like -2 or 3 dB, because I found that on some recordings, it did introduce a little bit of a sort of shimmery effect. But the plus side with the Clear was that you did still get a little more of that sort of air and treble extension after that as well. So with the Elex, it's just not quite there. But I still think that's a trade-off that not everybody is going to see as negative. So and I can certainly see this being more palatable for anybody who is a little bit sensitive to that region in the treble. Now, I'd mentioned that I'd also been running this off of a tube amplifier, the Cayenne HA1A Mark II. Which is the tube amp behind me. This was one of the coolest experiences, the coolest combinations for a headphone and an amplifier that I've gotten a chance to hear, because the Cayenne tube amp, while it is a tube amp and it is going to warm things up a little bit, and it's also going to maybe smooth out some of the treble a little bit, it also does have higher output impedance than the solid-state amplifiers. And these headphones, in fact, I'm pretty sure all of the full-size high-end Focal headphones are like this. They have kind of like an impedance bump there, like right at around like above 50 hertz. So if you use a higher output impedance source, this will boost the bass on these headphones quite a bit. So with the Cayenne tube amp, not only are you getting some of that tube warmth, you're also getting quite a bit of extra bass boost as a result of the impedance change. And this means that the frequency response ends up being quite a bit more bass elevated. And while, yes, I do EQ this headphone as well, I don't EQ it actually that much, but The bass boost on this was a ton of fun. Now, this is definitely too much in my opinion. It does get into bass head levels. It does also become a little bit on the muddy side there for the bass, and it does obscure some of the clarity that it otherwise has. But you still get a fantastic sense of that sort of musicality and euphony that, yeah, these are just terms that don't make any sense to anybody. What I ended up doing actually was, because this boosted the bass so much, I then made a separate custom EQ profile that reduced, that 200 to 300 hertz range a little bit to make it so that it was a little bit better, a little more in line. And then also it did smooth out a little bit of the treble there and made it so that that slight aggressiveness or aggressive edge really wasn't bad at all. So I do have a recommendation for you guys. If you guys own one of these, or if you're looking at one of these and you're worried about some of that treble response and you don't want to EQ anything, I do recommend trying this with a tube amplifier. It doesn't have to be this one specifically, but just something that is going to smooth out some of that treble response. And I know there's people out there who are like, no tubes, never, I'm not doing it, it's distortion and, etc. But if you like a smoother sound, that's definitely one of the ways to do it. But in any case, let me do some comparisons here. I've been comparing this mostly to the Focal Clear, and like I mentioned, this is mostly like a Focal Clear Lite, let's say. And that even isn't really doing it justice, because this is almost exactly the same as the Focal Clear. And then it does some things better, and I think it does some things not as good, depending on, who you are. So if you don't like that 10K emphasis that the Clear has, then this might be the better choice. But if you want a little bit more air up there, then I think the Clear does do a better job. For the most part, this is a very similar headphone, and all the things that the Clear does well, the Elex does well. So personally, yes, I would still take the Clear, but it's a very, very close call between the two. The other important comparison that I think is worth making at the $700 price mark is the HiFiMAN Ananda, which, while it might say it's on sale for $700, it's pretty much permanently at that price. And the Ananda is another headphone that I think is sort of one of the best under $1,000. The Ananda is really good for instrument separation, and it's got good detail, and it's got a better, more spacious presentation than the Elex. See, I almost said Clear. But the one downside with the Ananda is that it's nowhere near as punchy and dynamic and impactful as the Elex, even though it has a more linear bass response. Would I take the Ananda over the Elex, though? That's a tough choice. And I really think it comes down to whether or not you value that punch and impact, or whether or not you value the separation quality and the smoothness and that slightly more, let's say, clear sound there from a higher elevation there for ear gain. But apart from that, I mean, these are both excellent, and I think they're both easily worth it in the sub $1,000 range. They'd both be near the top of my list for stuff I'd recommend under $1,000. The other headphone I want to compare this to is the Odyssey LCD2F. Now I'm saying F because that's to differentiate it from the classic and the pre-phaser. That's this headphone here, and I will be doing a review of this one soon. But the reason I bring this up is because this is also right at around $1,000. Now this one, while it is a large full-sized LCD Odyssey, it is heavy. It's not actually uncomfortable. It's not so heavy that it crushes your neck. The fact that the LX is a more normal headphone isn't, the best reason to choose it over the LCD2F. And I think the main thing that this is going to come down to between these two is whether or not you EQ. Because if you don't EQ, the LX is easily the better choice. If you are willing to get into doing some EQ, the LCD2F I do think is going to be better. It can potentially have better sound because these, I mean, that's really what these are all about. If you're into the Odyssey kind of thing, you'd really, I mean, doing yourself a favor if you start learning how to EQ these. The technical performance on these full-sized Odysseys like the LCD2F and the LCD-X and whatnot, that's just crazy good. And if you're comfortable doing EQ, you can get the tonal balance to be really, really good as well. Out of the box, the tonal balance here is not really that great because it doesn't have the appropriate ear gain that you might want, and the Elex does. So again, if you want a warmer sound, that's probably okay, but the Elex is definitely more, let's say, technically correct there for where the ear amplifies, certain frequencies. Now, personally, yeah, I would take the LCD2 and I would EQ this. Keep in mind, though, this is also $300 more expensive. So yeah, maybe you get better instrument separation and an overall clearer image and everything, but it does, take a bit of EQ to get you there. And if not, then yeah, I do recommend the Elex over the LCD2F. Now, comparing it to the LCD GX, I actually am going to give the edge in technical performance, once again, to the Focal Elex. There's too many X's in these. The the reason being is that while the GX does do a good job, it's actually one of the better tuned Odyssey, full-size Odysseys, and more so than the LCD2F. The GX, it doesn't have the same punch and impact of the Elex, and it's also not as good as the LCD2F, and the detail also isn't as good as the LCD2F. So for me, I do think that I would prefer the Elex over the GX, even though, yes, the GX does do certain things better, like it, the planar image separation and all that stuff. It really just comes down to, I think, what you're going to value the most between those two. And yeah, for me, the punch out of this thing is insane. So I could easily see a reason to go for this over the GX. But yeah, if you want a warmer, smoother sound, the GX is going to give that to you for sure. And lastly, compared to the HiFiMAN Sundara, which is a $350 headphone that many of you guys know is kind of like my benchmark there for the everything under $700. And the Elex is, I think, the next step up from that headphone. For internal detail, when you're listening to not particularly busy passages, the detail retrieval of the Elex is better. When you get into busy passages, complex layerings and things like that, the planars are able to just sort of keep that stuff controlled a little bit better. And so the images are still a little more well defined on those planars, both the Sundara and the LCD2. And so really, I mean, if that is a priority for you, then maybe this isn't worth upgrading to from the Sundara, and you might be better off going with the Ananda or the GX or the LCD2F. But in my opinion, if you own a Sundara and you're looking to upgrade and you're looking for something else and something different, this is that headphone, because this is going to give you the punch and slam that headphone doesn't have. I mean, yes, it's fine for that, but this is better. And for frequency response, yeah, maybe the Sundara is a little smoother in the treble, and overall the Sundara probably matches the target a little more closely, but I really, really do like the way that this sounds overall, and I do think that I would choose this over the Sundara. If someone were just be like, have one or the other, I would probably pick the LX. I said it wrong, the Elex. Okay, so let me give a conclusion, and I'm gonna wear it while I'm giving a conclusion, because that's more fun. All right, oh, that is not long enough on the extension. Hopefully I'm not wearing this backwards. That would be really embarrassing. In conclusion, do I recommend the Focal Elex? Well, I really think it comes down to either the Elex or the Ananda at this price. And it's really going to come down to whether or not you prefer the punch and slam that something like the Elex will give you, the Focal drivers, or if you want the image separation, soundstage, maybe a little smoother in the treble there, maybe a little bit more clarity with the HiFiMAN Ananda, and then that would be your choice. For me, it's a tough one, and I could see going either way on that. But right now, with that Cayenne tube amp, I'm absolutely loving this headphone. So yeah, I definitely do recommend it. Just I'd say make sure you know what kind of presentation you prefer, and then make your choice based on that. Because they both are excellent headphones, and they're both well-tuned, have great technical performance, and it just depends on which qualities you value more. In any case, that does it for this video. Thanks for taking the time to watch it, and I will see you guys in the next one. Bye for now.